I think we've got this organized. We'll be hearing from me and Max in person, and in between, we've got Anya Lind from Berlin in Germany on Zoom, and she'll be joining us, and I will introduce them as soon as I wrap up my piece. And I'm going to start by saying, starting a stopwatch, we're calling this session Recovering the Utopian Imperative. And on one level, it feels a little absurd to be talking about utopianism in the current climate. We're facing onslaught of fascist authoritarianism from the highest levels of the US government. We're facing climate breakdown and all of the more immediate local and regional issues that we just heard about from Oren and Anne. We're in a rough time. But as I will argue, the utopian tradition that the ISE has always been a part of has been central to what's sustained movements through difficult times in the past, what's sustained resistance to authoritarianism in the past, and that is as relevant as ever right now. The opening image is one that most, if not all of you, are familiar with. That's Cave Farm, where the ISE was founded 50 years ago as a center for social ecology, but also as a demonstration site for new renewable technologies, which were really, in many ways, brand new at the time, even though many of them involved refurbishing of very old technologies like that wind power generator. And Cave Farm is just over the hill here. There was another campus that we used to be based at behind the library, and a trail along the field that led right to Cave Farm, which is now an operating organic farm that's still an important resource for this area, even though the ISE wasn't able to stay there. And from its inception, of course, the Institute has been combining the oppositional and reconstructive dimensions of our movements. And Dan, who's coming in the back door, in his work has always emphasized the utopian dimension, the utopian tradition, and that continues to be a central part of social ecology, which spawned a whole tradition of utopian imagery, which the solar punk movement that Max is representing is in many ways the main current inheritor of. Utopian imagery and art, and to efforts toward actualization through publications, mostly on the West Coast, like Rain Magazine and Coevolution, both of which Murray wrote for fairly regularly. This was a poster done by somebody who was part of the Beehive Collective in Maine, who was a friend of the ISE.
In West Danville, Vermont. Now in West Danville, Vermont.
Right. They opened a print shop right here in West Danville. So this tradition has a long legacy, and we've tried to play our role in sustaining it. My personal, and I'll mention that some of what I'll be talking about today is from an older article that I'll say a little bit about in a bit, and a lot of it is from an article that just came out this summer in the journal New Politics that you can find on their website. I got more directly immersed in this conversation back in 2009, which was also an especially difficult time in the climate movement. Obama had just pushed through a change at the UN level from countries being expected to make mandatory reductions in their emissions of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. And at the climate conference in 2009, Obama pushed through this shift to countries making voluntary pledges, what they now call nationally determined contributions, which you've probably seen in some of the press coverage of the climate conference coming up in a couple of months in Brazil. They didn't even call it anything, that they couldn't agree to call it anything more demanding on countries than making their contributions to climate reductions. And in the aftermath of that, the people in the movement were pretty depressed. It was a low point. And our friends in Norway were publishing a social ecology magazine called Communalism and asked me to contribute something commenting on the state of the movement and the state of the climate. So I came up with this article that was called Toward Utopia or Apocalypse. A lot of the background to this was rooted in my experience teaching a class on the evolution of radical environmentalism at UVM at a time when the most popular writing that was claiming the mantle of radical environmentalism was from people like Derek Jensen, John Zerzan, whose politics, in my view and in the view of all of us at the Institute really, was fundamentally reactionary in a whole variety of ways that I don't have time to go into. But Jensen's 3-volume incoherent ramble called Endgame, which was 3 volumes of 500 or 600 pages, was being devoured by a lot of young activists. Deep Green Resistance, which in my view had the main result of making it easy for the state to entrap a lot of naive young activists into doing things that they wouldn't have done otherwise, that ended up meaning they faced intense prosecutions for planning so-called criminal activities, and of course Zerzan's work on primitivism and the whole idea of the end of civilization as somehow inevitable, for some of these folks, a desirable end of our activism. And of course, Jensen's famous quote from his Orion magazine article in 2006, that hope is just a curse, that it's inherently false, that it keeps us passive. At the same time, in popular culture, there was this outpouring of severely dystopian images. And these are the ones that most came to my mind from that period, and I'm sure all of you, especially folks following current popular culture, can come up with dozens and dozens more examples of the pervasiveness of this kind of dystopian, apocalyptic, catastrophe-oriented thinking. So in my article, I made an effort to think through how to counter that. And 3 sources I've relied on. The first one on the left actually came out, and I'll give you some quotes from these in a bit. The one on the left came out a couple of years later than that Communalism magazine article, terrific compilation co-edited by a number of people, including our friend Eddie Ewan, who's taught at the ISC from the Bay Area. Of course, Ernst Bloch's classic 3-volume work on the principle of hope, which I was turned on to by Murray many decades ago and have at many points gone back to various chapters and passages from. And then this really interesting museum volume that I discovered at the UVM library around the same time, that was a collaboration of the New York Public Library and the National Museum of France. Just checking the time here. I'm already halfway through my time. That pulls together an incredible compendium of utopian imagery going back to early Western history and examples from other parts of the world, and also a series of really interesting essays by scholars of utopian thought. I just found a copy in one of the online used book sources for $10. This book is available and I couldn't recommend it more. And some of the thoughts that emerged from those sources, I won't read them in detail. The first and third are from the Catastrophism book The middle one by Ole Martin Sandberg, a professor from Iceland, is from an article that he published in the Radical Philosophy Review more recently in 2020, basically making the point that catastrophic thinking is inherently more beneficial to reactionary and right-wing movements. It rallies the troops of the far right. Fear and paranoia serve a rightist political predisposition far more than a left or liberal one. Authoritarian politics benefits more than left politics from fear, something that we all know intuitively from our experience following the media over the last several years. Sandberg, in many ways resonant with my article, but arguing from a much more pragmatic place, that even if you don't believe in utopianism, that these realities apply to an understanding of political dynamics, that exaggerating the threat of collapse is more likely to make us cling to the social system that exists and want to preserve the status quo. Panic is exploited by authoritarians. We see that every single day right now. And the narrative of collapse is inherently, he said might be, I would say inherently part of the problem. And then a third piece from the Catastrophism book, that apocalyptic scenarios are inherently mystical in a sense, and that it's much more helpful to think about revolution as a dramatic convergence of real practices of rebellion and resistance that acquire a new form. And in many presentations here at the ISE over the years, I've highlighted some alternative perspectives from Richard Flax, talking about the centrality of movements that reinvigorate people's sense that we can make our own history. Ernst Bloch pointing out that fraudulent hope is a malefactor, even an innovator of the human race, while concretely genuine hope is its most dedicated benefactor. The late 20th century sociologist Karl Mannheim, who's quoted in the museum collection, saying the utopian mentality is at the base of all serious social change, and Emanuel Wallerstein, whose work I'm sure many of you are familiar with, who did a series of lectures on this in the early 2000s, where he said the answer to disillusionment is to consider the substantive rationality of alternative possible historical systems, which I think is very much resonant with some of Dan's writing, arguing for the need for a practical utopianism that allows us and that encourages us and that helps us realize some of these forms in practice. Today, of course, we're in a very different time. And you probably recognize a lot of these images. The top two are from California, where wildfires sweep huge areas every year. The lower left is from Houston after one of the recent hurricanes, and the lower right, of course, is from Montpelier in the aftermath of the catastrophic flood of the summer of 2023. And there's a whole school of scholarship that's emerged in just the last few years, exploring this idea that maybe we're already in a post-apocalyptic period, and that doesn't mean we need to resort to a politics of despair. They distinguish climate doomism from climate realism, emphasize that what we do still matters, but also that neither the kind of total apocalypse that some climate activists have predicted, nor complete prevention are really possible in this time. A number of Northern European scholars who I cite in my article have done research interviewing people with perspectives that they view as resonant with this post-apocalyptic outlook, who are actually out in the world doing important, inspiring, leading-edge work. One Dutch political scientist has studied climate adaptation efforts in cities across Northern Europe, and finding that some of the activists who are furthering this work share this outlook of post-apocalypse, but are still doing leading-edge work in their communities. Another important scholar points out that this whole, and I'm sure this will resonate with folks here, that this whole discourse of catastrophism and apocalypse is extremely Eurocentric. In the climate justice movement, we know that people in the global south have been dealing with the consequences of climate breakdown, of extreme weather events for many decades. In some parts of the world, according to recent research from Berkeley, Earth actually as far back as the late 1970s, places in Southeast Asia and Eastern South America were starting to experience the direct consequences of climate disruptions. This is not new for people in much of the world. Of course, the antidote, a big part of the antidote, and I'm over time already, is mutual aid. Upper left is the aftermath of the flooding in Montpelier. Keith McHenry, who I imagine others of you also know, one of the original founders of Fruit Not Bombs, who helped make that a movement with chapters in cities and towns all around the world. And this group on the right, which is from Sweden, which is kind of tried to co-opt the language of prepping for catastrophe, but in a way that embraces mutual aid and community-based solutions. Just last month, in the woods in the middle of Germany, there was a conference organized by a number of highly disillusioned, I would say, climate activists, people who were involved in some of the most exciting direct action campaigns confronting fossil fuel infrastructure in Germany, and felt that those campaigns had largely failed, convened something that they called the collapse camp. And it was very much oriented toward practical skills, how to cope with catastrophic events, but there was a real utopian current through it. One of my mentees through the ISE mentorship program, who's based in Switzerland, went there to do a workshop on social ecology and communalism, and 50 people showed up. And they've stayed in contact over email and Signal, and are starting to federate and organize and spread the ideas of social ecology throughout the German-speaking world. But it was right even in the call to the collapse camp, the idea that even in collapse, our struggle for the best possible world for all does not stop. I've got a bunch more quotes that I don't have time to get into. You can read about it in my article. Somebody from the disability movement, who I first learned about from the last chapter of Naomi Klein's recent Doppelganger book, but her article in Orion from 2021, Sonara Taylor, and her book on the effect, the movement in New Mexico against military toxins and the disability that spread, but also the movement that spread is an important example. And recent work by Henry Giroux, who a lot of us know from his contributions to education theory, mostly thanks to Kathleen, has been writing a lot on the current political situation for Counterpunch, and in one of his recent columns he said, hope in the present context is not naive optimism, but a call to organized resistance, a refusal to accept the conditions of cruelty as inevitable. And I'll end today with a quote that my article ends with from Rebecca Solnit's book, Hope in the Dark, from 2004, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, where she says, to hope is to gamble, is to bet on the future, on your desires, on the possibility that an open heart and uncertainty is better than gloom and safety. To hope is dangerous, and yet it is the opposite of fear, for to live is to risk. And that's the note I'll end on. Assuming the technology is working, I will turn it over to Anya. But first let me introduce the other two speakers. We'll hear in a minute. Here, let me get her up on the screen. So I have to click stop sharing and, oh, the projector is now fixated on this tab. How do I close window? Choose mirror from the menu. How do I get to the, is that the menu? Oh, yeah, screen mirroring. Choose content. What do I want to show? Window or app. Yeah, here we go. Okay, all right. So you see in the, here, let me close the participants thing so we can see our presenters more clearly. And move this, make this a little smaller for just a little bit.
Why don't you
while,
pin her?
what's that?
You might want to pin her.
Well, she's going to be showing slides. But that'll just take time.
Did the whole thing come back to enlarge the...
No.
What's that?
Yeah, we can mark it.
No, we're good, and we've got a speaker hooked up, so it should be fine.
You want to yeah, so she can see us?
No.
What?
Yeah,
No.
those
No.
Okay, there we go, much better. It has been my pleasure over the last almost year now to work with Anya as part of the ISC mentorship program. Anya Lind is a lecturer and doctoral candidate in North American literature and critical future studies at the Technical University of Dresden in Germany. Her dissertation focuses on future imaginations of energy and power in science fiction via anarchist political philosophy, social ecology, and the energy and environmental humanities. After Anya, we'll hear from Max, who you've all met. Max Kochalski is an artist and organizer who works at the intersection of new media and social practice to prefigure egalitarian potentialities. As a member of the Solar Punk Surf Club, which is an artists collective, he's presented projects internationally in galleries, museums, and forest occupations. Max lives and works in Kentucky's Bluegrass region, where he hosted the recent ISE Summer Intensive on the art of organizing, and he's a cooperator at Art Farm in Lexington, the facility where the intensive happened, and that's a new commons that combines the creative autonomy of an artist-run space with the democratic spirit of a free school. So I will turn it over to Anya, and then we'll hear from Max.
Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Lower.
Excellent. Can you additionally see my slides?
Yes.
Yes.
Even better.
Thank you.
Am I good to go?
Yes.
Perfect. Hi, everyone. My talk today acts as something of a bridge in this panel, conjoining partly with Brian's history and partly with what's to come in Max's discussion of cutting-edge utopianism. I'm focusing today on the configuration and reconfiguration of a particular kind of utopia, the utopia of networks, from the Ansible to the internet to ecological cybernetics. I'm very sorry I can't be there in person, and I suppose whether the tech functions throughout the whole talk might act as a kind of meta commentary on the utopian potential of networks. Fingers crossed. I'd like to start in the long 1970s with Ursula Le Guin's classic anarchist utopia, The Dispossessed. Part of the literary wave of critical utopias in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, the critical utopia is characterized by a foregrounding of environmental and social justice issues and a move away from the classical utopian blueprints and towards the utopian process. What must be struggled against, how it may be achieved, and how it may be maintained. Such literary utopias act as crucial propaganda, and education and desire, as Miguel Arbensola famously puts it. Le Guin's narrative is also key to a genealogy of networking in utopia, to the notion that communication is, in the broadest sense, a utopian necessity and a utopian goal. It is, in this way, a properly Cold War novel, beautifully indicated, I find, by Fatih Rafi's cover design on the right for the 50th anniversary edition. The protagonist, a physicist by the name of Shevik, is driven by an almost singular need. The need that had brought him across the dry abyss from his anarchic homeworld to its capitalist satellite. The need for communication. The wish to unbuild walls. Shevik is trying to develop an instant interstellar communication device, the Ansible, which Marxist science fiction critic Frederick Jameson positions as the symbolic and ideological centre of Le Guin's cosmos. It is not merely a necessary plot device for her intergalactic oeuvre across her many novels, it is Le Guin's centrally utopian postulate. It would make a league of worlds possible, the Earth Ambassador speaks breathlessly, a federation. It's as if you had invented a human speech. We can talk. At last we can talk together. The Ansible is an image of unbuilding the wall of the Iron Curtain, of all peoples talking to one another beyond propaganda and wars, whether they be cold, hot, or even cultural. All that one needs, the ambassador thinks, is free, open, instantaneous communication, and no hierarchy will be able to withstand it, no oppression either. Solidarity will emerge to those targeted by injustice, and power will necessarily decentralize into that free federation of worlds or communes. Le Guin's optimism is guarded, however. It is a critical utopia after all. Shevik's response immediately puts a question mark to the very notion of the network utopia. And what will you say? Norman Spinrad's post-apocalyptic 1980 utopia, Songs from the Stars, is thematically similar, albeit additionally embracing the dystopian anxiety of the Cold War alongside its utopian impulse of free communication. Set after the smash, the global nuclear holocaust so often imagined in the fiction of this period, what is perhaps the last surviving outpost of humanity within the foothills of the Sierras, using renewable energy to cultivate an ecotopian life. In some sense, an exploration of Marshall McLuhan's media scholarship, one of the protagonists, Sunshine Sue, is motivated by discovering his understanding media to try and recreate a global electronic village. A world satellite broadcast network, she thinks, must surely act as the basis for a new, unified planetary culture, the ability to see the Earth once more as a world entire, and, not least, perhaps find any other pockets of surviving humanity. Communication, the network, is once more the crucial utopian gesture, particularly manifest in the titular Songs from the Stars, messages from aliens that they must travel to a space station to hear. In the novel's central irony, these messages are attempts to explain how to survive technological advancement and not end in nuclear holocaust and total annihilation. The message, as in Le Guin, could not be clearer. It is free, open communication that must end the Cold War, all wars, or else it is oppression, tyranny, and death that will ultimately reign. It is impossible to read these novels in 2025 without thinking about the internet, what ought to have been exactly this techno-utopian revolution of free, instantaneous cross-border communication, and what has become the increasingly dystopian reality of the internet is actually poignantly impressively described by Spinrad himself, such that it's hard not to laugh. Such a radio network as Sunshine Sue dreamed of creating, he writes, could become an instrument of mind-fucking on a scale beyond anything the blackest heart lusted after if put to the wrong use. Yeah, no kidding. In an astute remark in his recent Ministry for the Future, Kim Stanley Robinson notes that the global revolution that internet advocates have been calling for since the beginning of the internet, from the cyber-feminists to the hacktivists to the techno-utopians and everyone in between, was not only poorly defined, it had never come to pass, unless, that is, one counted the great privatization of the late 1990s, echoing recent analyses of the techno-feudalism that the internet has helped to inaugurate. The internet has become a kind of techno-utopia, but not one of Le Guin's or Spinrad's free, wall-unbuilding communication, and instead one for the technocrats interested in building precisely those very walls. The internet has had revolutionary moments from a social movement perspective, quite literally in the case of Tahrir Square in Egypt in 2011, but while valuable for networking dissidents, it's been far from infallible. As Zeynep Tufekci, a scholar on the role of social media and digital tools for protests and social movements, puts it, power always learns, and powerful tools always fall into its hands. In a mounting age of algorithmic governance, it's become clear that Spinrad and Le Guin's guarded utopian communication was alone not enough. One may have access to communicating, but no guarantee that anyone ever receives this communication, filtered away by biases programmed in by the technocrats in charge. Shevek was right to question the social aspect of the technology, but wrong in the precise framing of his question. One must not ask what will be communicated, but how this communication will be filtered, disseminated, suppressed. Today's attention economy, foregrounding misinformation and rage bait, shows this only all too clearly. Both The Dispossessed and Songs from the Stars also dovetail with an earlier foundational form of network utopia, that of cybernetics. First defined in the 19th century by André-Marie Ampère as the science of governance, Norbert Wiener's 1948 book Cybernetics was defining for the concept, building on his work during the Second World War, designing biomechanical systems for tracking and shooting enemy planes. The discipline, oriented around control and communication between animal and machine, in Wiener's words, materialized in the crucible of war twice over. Wiener was influenced by John von Neumann, who built machines to coordinate the tens of thousands working on the Manhattan Project under the direction of Robert Oppenheimer. As French collective Tikkun put it in their cybernetic hypothesis, the modern computer and the atomic bomb were thus born together, the origin for today's communications utopia. Le Guin's inspiration for her character Shevek, the developer of her Ansible, was of course this same Oppenheimer, a family friend of the Le Guins, and the precise technological dialectic of networking and atomic power is the thematic core of Spinrad's novel. More than this, however, Spinrad's Songs from the Stars was inspired by a 4-hour interview he conducted with the ever-eccentric Buckminster Fuller. Fuller's notion of spatial Earth was a crucial node in the development of ecological cybernetics, naturally following on from Wiener's human-animal definition. With its quest for total information, governance and control, cybernetics has been centrally influential for the development of ecological science. The very word ecosystem stands as a reminder that the history of ecology is enmeshed with systems theory and presupposes that species entanglements are operational or functional. Murray, as I'm sure you're all aware, was scathingly critical of this move, refuting Fuller and McLuhan both for having developed a language and theory devastating to the social and the ecological. If you'll indulge me, I've chosen a long quote. It's no longer a New Age cliché, he writes, to insist that wherever possible we must unplug our inputs from a depersonalized, mindless system that threatens to absorb us into its circuitry. In little more than a decade, we have been victimized by our electronic and cybernetic society more than the most outspoken critics of everyday life could have anticipated in the 60s. Here is then the challenge. For all that the network utopia has failed to fulfill its utopian promise, we are reading Bookchin after half a century more of electronic and cybernetic victimization. We live now at a point in which many of us seem completely absorbed into its circuitry. It's perhaps fitting that I'm Skyping into you through a screen 6,000 kilometers away. Our task is no longer severing from these systems. I think it would be primitivist to try and reverse the internet and much of our digitization. And many on the left indeed still invest utopian dreams into the internet and cybernetics, theorizing fully automated luxury communism, digital socialism, animal cybernetics, and more. Our task must be to reconfigure the idea of the network utopia in a way which is socially ecological, which is not steeped twice over in war or in modernist fantasies of sterilized systematization and control. It's here that we ought to turn to Ruth Anna Emrys's 2022 novel, A Half-Built Earth, part of the wave of new literary utopianism blossoming over the last 15 years, and a direct inheritor to both Le Guin's Dispossessed and Spinrad's Songs from the Stars. This is visible from its very outset, at the moment of first contact, when two symbiotic alien species land together in the Chesapeake Bay. No one wanted to spoil the moment of joy, Emrys writes. We didn't want to play nation-style realpolitik or be properly mature and suspicious. We wanted to talk. Communication is, as in the critical utopias before her, Emrys's central utopian postulation. Not a communication dominated by structures of power and hierarchy, but one that is open, free, and mutual. It is a communication that, unlike in Spinrad's novel, comes in time. The aliens have picked up signals from other species, but have arrived in each case too late, each fallen prey to their own technologically mediated demise. This is the central hook. All species, the aliens insist, must leave their birth worlds, or give up their technological development, or die. It is this dichotomy of technology and ecology, against the cybernetic backdrop of the computer and the atomic bomb, which a half-built Earth tries to negotiate. The aliens standing in for the cybernetic technocrats and living quite literally on spaceship Earths. Spaceships with ecologies reduced to the simplest manageable constellation of species, that is, only those which are operational and functional. Between this technocracy and the primitivism and climate collapse that otherwise haunts the climate fiction genre, Emrys attempts to negotiate a third way of technological and ecological coexistence, an ecologically networked utopia, but one that responds to the brief blighted bloom of the World Wide Web of our today. She imagines a post-revolutionary ecological federation of watersheds spread across the globe, communicating digitally to administer areas of common concern, but otherwise self-governing locally, with sensors distributed across river basins, soil, trees and mountains, and a wearable mesh that allows humans to tap into this network of information. Cybernetic networking represents for Emrys a profound ecological possibility and is framed as precisely ecological. A networking flow is like a walk in the woods for the mind. If I weren't exhausted, I'd have done that too, the protagonist thinks. Gone down to the Anacostia, or out to Rock Creek Park, the soft pine underfoot and the spray of mossy water, beside the path and the creek of crows. Everything connected in a system that I could contribute to, but never control. That's truth, tangible as a planet. Emrys performs an elegant double motion here. She appropriates the tools of cybernetics while simultaneously defying their foundational organizing logic of domination and control. Indeed, she insists that such total informational control was a fiction. Algorithms were inherently biased, she writes. You had to design deliberately for the biases that mattered to you. They could be programmed to speak for the needs of river and tree and air, but must do so in a way consciously biased toward the long-term values you choose to preserve. Emrys is not naive to the cooptation of such networks. Their hacking, infection, and subversion is central to the plot. But this potential for damage must not condemn the technology, just as, in a telling intertextual climax, the aliens' employment of Ursula Le Guin's own Ansible to coordinate a kidnapping of the protagonists does not condemn communicative techniques per se. It merely highlights their fallibility that must be intentionally designed for. The same is true, Emrys concludes, of political organisation. The cybernetic dandelion networks were, like humans themselves, living things, as dependent on the flow of information as I was in breath and pulse. Cut off that flow when we devolved into sputtering, isolated neurons. With algorithms biased in for consensus ethics, and permanently evolving with shifts in political, ecological, and moral goals, Emrys posits a network that is itself socially ecological and might engender in turn a socially ecological politics in which all important human decisions are intimately contingent on a diversity of non-human insights and shared human expertise. In so doing, a half-built Earth works not only to recover the utopian imperative amidst our difficult present, it also recovers the central utopian potential inherent in the network, reconfiguring the network utopia in a way that I think we must learn from. Thanks.
Thank you, Anya. And I'll turn it over to Max. You want to switch to your slides on here? Just share them so Anya can also see them, and then use the Zoom screen. That's how we did it before. Or I can do it. I think, actually, I think the window is minimized right now. So I need to first go here, and then go to slideshow, And then, how did I do? Oh, I don't know if I can do it on Google. On my individual slides, I was able to stay full screen and still share. Share it down there. Oh, now you can do full screen and slideshow. Okay. Oh, and now we gotta go back up to there. Yeah. All right, we got it.
All right. All right, hey everyone, thank you. It's an honor to be here with Brian and Anya to discuss the Utopian impulse. My contribution today focuses on how we perceive and materialize utopia, specifically through what my collaborators and I call social ecological aesthetics. And I want to argue that recovering the utopian imperative requires us to take aesthetics seriously, not as a secondary concern, but as the living process through which a free ecological society becomes perceptible and buildable.
The up and down keys work, yeah.
Okay. Murray Bookchin, social ecology's primary theorist, argued that hierarchy distorts both how we see the world, or our sensibility, and what he called our techniques, our tools, and also our social technologies. Solar Punk Surf Club's position is that social ecological aesthetics can help us organize a free and ecological society by both reawakening the senses and remaking techniques. In other words, we can rediscover our interdependencies through art that connects us to land, labor, and each other, and we can create systems and tools that harmonize with nature, empower communities, and foster creativity and freedom.
Let's make sure Anya can still hear us. Anya, can you still hear us okay?
2 thumbs up. Great. This is because, as I mentioned, aesthetics is not secondary to politics. It's a medium through which politics becomes lived experience. This framework reveals aesthetics as a terrain of struggle because aesthetics shapes what we do about collapse. If we see only ruin, we bunker down. If we see fertile ground, we plant. This is why social ecology needs an aesthetic theory in practice, because domination survives by deadening our senses, and the struggle for a new world is also a struggle over how to see, feel, and create it. I'll share these afterwards, don't worry. I have to get through a lot of material here. So, let's back up. What do we mean by aesthetics? Aesthetics can be broadly defined as a philosophy of art and a theory of beauty. As I said earlier, it has to do with how we perceive and construct the world. And to ground this, I want to introduce a key process. Aesthetics as the dialectic of sensibility and techniques. Okay, what does that mean? Let's break it down with some definitions and examples. Dialectic refers to a process where interdependent forces or ideas don't just interact, but dynamically shape and co-constitute each other in a transformative feedback loop. Unlike simple cause and effect, it's a dynamic tension that generates new realities over time. This tension isn't static like a seesaw, it's productive like a river carving a canyon. Sensibility refers to our capacity to perceive, feel, and interpret the world. It's both developed through and expressed by techniques. Sensibility includes sense perception, color, sound, texture. It includes emotions, affect, feelings of joy, melancholy, awe, despair, and how we interpret or make meaning of those stimuli and feelings through narrative, metaphorical, or critical modes. Techniques are the embodied skills, tools, and social practices that materialize sensibility into form. They include both physical tools and digital technologies, from paint to algorithms. They include the expertise and technique required to use them, and our social practices for around how that knowledge and labor is organized. Techniques and sensibility co-evolve. Technical choices reflect and reinforce ways of perceiving the world, while sensibility influences the development and use of techniques. Through the lens of dialectical naturalism, the philosophical framework of social ecology, we can say that aesthetics have the power to reflect and reshape our social ecological relations. Art, then, is not a static image. but a force of nature, an active participant in the shaping of social ecological reality. I'll have a bit more to say about social ecological aesthetics in a moment, but first I want to illustrate this dialectic with a few examples across traditions. Our first example is Renaissance painting, exemplified here by Leonardo da Vinci's Virgin of the Rocks, painted between 1483 and 86. In these works, a new sensibility, humanist awe, religious devotion, perspectival depth, fused with new techniques, oil glaze layering, linear perspective, and anatomical precision. This dialectic transformed perception itself. The technical mastery of chiaroscuro, the interplay of light and shadow, intensified emotional drama, while mathematical perspective trained viewers to see space as rationally ordered yet divinely infinite. The Renaissance canvas thus became both a product and producer of consciousness, a window that didn't just depict worldviews but actively schooled the eye in new modes of sacred and scientific attention. Our next example takes us to the mid-20th century jazz scene, embodied here by Charlie Parker and the young Miles Davis circa 1950. In this musical form, we witness spontaneity as the prevailing creative sensibility, along with the emotions associated with blues tonality, as well as the musical dialogue among the collective ensemble, merged with complex chord progressions, instrumental virtuosity, and the call and response tradition that goes back to West African music. In jazz's dialectic, technical proficiency of harmonic scales enabled unprecedented expressive freedom, where standardized popular songs became vehicles for African American innovators to transform European harmonic structures into a distinctly black modernist art. Our third example, apropos to the theme of today, is the Utopian novel, a genre spanning from Thomas More's 1516 foundational work, Utopia, to modern ecological and anarchist visions like Le Guin's Dispossessed and Starhawk's The Fifth Sacred Thing. In this literary tradition, a sensibility of sweeping social critique, desire for an alternative ideal to the prevailing social order, and an Enlightenment-inspired belief in rationally perfectible systems fuses with the specific techniques of pseudo-ethnographic reportage, detailed blueprints of social institutions from law to land use, and a dialogic or comparative narrative structure that juxtaposes the ideal society with its flawed counterpart. This fusion creates a dialectic that trains political imagination, the technical act of constructing a comprehensive social model, detailing its daily routines, governance, and beliefs, guided by a rationalist faith that problems of distribution, governance, and conflict can be logically solved through superior social design, even if in later works this remains an ongoing process or struggle, often with inherent flaws and tensions, nevertheless makes social hope tangible. The Utopian novel is thus both a product of its time's anxieties and a producer of political consciousness, teaching the reader not merely to wish for change, but to engineer it conceptually through methods of systemic critique and reconstruction. Before we can talk more about solar punk and social ecological aesthetics, unfortunately, we must first examine the capitalist aesthetics of our dominant system, which subordinates art, people, and nature to the demands of private property and profit. Capitalism produces an aesthetically specific kind of alienation, a dulling of perception. This is why sterile, homogeneous visual language of grayish monoculture feels normal, and why we can feel a sense of despair instead of possibility when facing ecological crisis. You can also think about capitalist sensibility as roughly synonymous with the idea of capitalist realism, coined by Mark Fisher, which describes how capitalism annihilates our ability to imagine its end. The more we're bombarded with apocalyptic imagery, burning forests, drowning cities, the more dystopian collapse feels inevitable rather than contingent. If capitalist sensibility dulls our ability to imagine alternatives, capitalist techniques enshrine that alienation in steel, concrete, and code. Here we draw on Murray Bookchin's critique of authoritarian techniques, technologies designed to centralize power, automate hierarchy, and sever people from participatory control over their lives. Under capitalism, extraction requires authoritarianism to suppress dissent, enforce privatized ownership, and naturalize exploitation. Secondly, carbon form, a term coined by the architect Elisa Iturbe, describes the spatial and architectural paradigm shaped by fossil fuel extraction and dependence. Carbon form is not just about energy use, but about how fossil capitalism molds physical space to serve so-called endless expansion. This form locks in exploitative, energy-intensive relations and cannot be fixed by superficial green additions like solar panels on a suburban home. Finally, digital ownership via NFTs turns art into speculative tokens, divorcing it from community meaning. Elite white cube galleries gatekeep art as a luxury good, excluding vernacular and folk traditions. The ruling class defunctionalizes the social purpose of art, reducing it to its commodity status in the name of profit, state or corporate propaganda, or even downright money laundering, practices known as art washing. Capitalist techniques like treating space as property or art as commodity don't just reflect alienation, they actively reproduce it. This creates a feedback loop. Techniques shape behavior. Behavior dulls sensibility, which then justifies worse techniques. The result is a world where, as Frederick Jameson noted, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. But this cycle isn't inevitable. Just as capitalist techniques breed alienation, liberatory techniques can cultivate new sensibilities. Enter social ecological aesthetics, a practice of unlearning capitalist realism and retraining our senses to perceive and remaking our techniques to build alternatives. Let's look at these ideas in turn. Social ecological aesthetics recognizes that to change the world, we must first change how we see, feel, and interpret it. A social ecological sensibility, therefore, sees nature not as static, isolated resources, but as a web of interrelationships engaged in a vast, evolving drama wherein differences strengthen the whole. Bookchin termed this unity in diversity, after observing how biodiversity creates resilience in ecosystems. This understanding fosters empathy, not in service of abstract duties or ideals, but as a deeply felt, embodied responsiveness to life in all its forms. Additionally, eco-social perception builds on social ecology's core insight that humanity is nature rendered self-conscious. This means we are not separate from nature. We are its imagination, its capacity to reflect on itself. If humans are nature rendered self-conscious, then art is nature transfiguring itself, transforming itself into something more beautiful, more elevated. Another aspect of social ecological sensibility involves a kind of lifting the veil to disrupt and demystify the capitalist myth that there is no alternative with the reality that we are surrounded by alternatives. Against capitalist realism, we might call this utopian realism, training ourselves to perceive and nurture the real latent utopias already growing in capitalism's cracks. But it's not enough to just imagine better worlds. To materialize these visions, to turn perception into praxis, we need liberatory techniques, tools, systems, creative practices that embody and translate eco-social sensibility into material form. First, our techniques must be above all ecological in the fullest sense of the term, not a capitalist logic, but an eco-logic. Eco-techniques goes beyond the merely sustainable to technologies and practices that actively regenerate what they use, or heal what has been harmed by centuries of extraction. Biophilic design, for example, calls for buildings, objects, and spaces that don't just mimic nature, but participate in it as living systems. Likewise, the so-called planned obsolescence of commodities produced under capitalism gives way to planned relevance, circular materials that account for long-term generational transfer and adaptive reuse. Democratic production is also central to liberatory techniques. While capitalist techniques reduce people to passive consumers and spectators, liberatory techniques foster active participation, transforming its users into collaborators and co-producers. These practices reject the enclosures of patents and copyright, instead nurturing open culture and the creative commons. The outcome is a shift from extractive carbon form to regenerative living form, where energy democracy merges with space as commons, giving rise to architectures of encounter and cultural objects designed for both human and more than human life. Our collective's name reflects the belief that solar punk embodies a social ecological aesthetic. This movement confronts capitalist catastrophe while sustaining radical hope for a communal ecological future. Its visions are utopian yet realist, post-scarcity but not post-conflict, and uncompromisingly ecological without lapsing into primitivism or misanthropy. In other words, solar punk worlds appear to be holistically articulated visions of social ecology, or what Bookchin called the image of a fecund interaction between humanity's craft and nature's potentialities. Of course, the term solar punk is contested and risks co-optation. As practitioners within this milieu, our ongoing contribution and intervention is to seed it with social ecological principles. Because to us, solar punk is more than a genre. It's the active synthesis of social ecological aesthetics and politics, imagining and building post-capitalist worlds where liberatory techniques cultivate eco-social sensibilities, which in turn spawn new utopian potentialities. So let's recap the essential contrast. Capitalism operates through dulled sensibility, alienated perception that masks interdependence, paired with authoritarian techniques, extractive systems reinforcing hierarchy. Liberation, in turn, demands their radical negation, a renewed sensibility grounded in eco-social attunement to life's interdependence, paired with a liberatory techniques that enacts regenerative, commons-creating, life-affirming technologies and productive practices. This is the transformative power of aesthetics, to reorient both vision and action, from enclosure to commons, from extraction to regeneration. Art emerges here as nature's creative self-transfiguration, where any engaged participant becomes an artist, weaving together liberatory techniques and awakened sensibility. In this combination of practice and perception, we learn to see beyond the given world and thus begin to build what might be. While a fully developed social ecological theory of aesthetics, of course, requires further elaboration, I hope I've conveyed some of its theoretical and practical significance. Like politics, every action or inaction carries aesthetic implications. I'll leave you with a final thought drawn from the closing passage of Murray Bookchin's speech, The Ecology Movement, Utopia or Technocracy. Any society that seeks to create utopia will not only be a society that is free, it also has to be a society that is beautiful. There can no longer be any separation, any more than between mind and body, between art and the development of a free society. We must become artists now, not only ecologists, utopians.
Now we get back on the projector. My glasses. Yeah, here we go. Window app. We'll just go to Zoom. Yes. All right, here we are. Well, I hope we gave you enough to chew on. We have about 20 minutes for questions and discussion before lunch. Let's start with Sean. Let's maybe, as we did earlier, maybe take 2 or 3 comments together. And Gabe, and anybody else? Let's start with Sean and Gabe, who we'll hear from at a lot more length this afternoon.
In listening to you talk about ecological aesthetic or social ecological aesthetic, I noticed that a lot of the things that you describe are things that exist in the sort of like homestead type individualist oriented world as well, the natural building materials and sort of like a concern for the look of the thing and its renewability and whatnot. I guess that I'm curious where you see social ecology like being able to participate in that as compared to what I think is probably the more familiar natural building kind of, or whatever, natural engagement aesthetic that tends to be hyper-individualist.
Again.
2 questions. First one for Max. How does this aesthetics play out in relationships? One question. It's not clear, but it seems to be a lot about art and material and curious stuff. The other mentioned. And then for Brian, you talked about the politics of fear. And I think as a younger person, speaking to older folks in my life, and the liberal to radical side, it seems more so now than ever like every conversation is rooted in fear. And I'm curious how we can not get caught in a reaction of a reaction. And I just get sort of frustrated continually hearing people speak out of politics of fear, even in these sort of spaces. So I'm curious of your own general critique of that.
To start?
Sure. I think the democratic production piece, I think, would prevent an individualist interpretation of what we're putting forth as socially logical aesthetics. And the sensibility of interdependence. I mean, there's the idea of seeking like individualist refuge in a homestead is, I think, a fantasy and not something that is part of the framework we're trying to present. Should I take the other one, or do you want to speak to that? Or?
You can start.
Okay. And then as far as how does aesthetics play out in relationships, I think the fundamental unit is relationships. It's a social relation. We're talking about art as a social relation. And that this separates a more vernacular understanding of aesthetics as like a surface, an image, which is easy to co-opt. And it's much harder to co-opt, a directly democratic process, which is time-consuming. It's much more difficult to co-opt something that is like open source in its techniques, for example. So yeah, I'm sorry if that didn't come across in the presentation, but social relations all the way down.
There's no question that the politics of fear is pervasive now, and there's so much in the world today to be fearful of. I mean, every day we read the news and there are more horrors, more people being abducted, more restrictions on people's basic rights to live in this world in a sane way. And it takes a lot of effort. I find myself, just like everybody, the more news I read, the more depressed I am, and I feel like I have to keep up with what's going on to understand what we can do. And sometimes I force myself to look beyond it and to focus on the potential, to focus on, first, the historical understanding that people have been successfully overthrowing authoritarian regimes maybe throughout human history, and that there are pockets, including right here in Vermont, of people continuing to live in more liberated ways and finding ways to keep a sense of hope and of a forward-looking potentiality in mind as we struggle against everything that's coming down on us. And there are no easy answers, but we look to history, we look to what we know about movements, and we look to all the incredible things that people are doing around the country and around the world to resist this reactionary tide. And for me, that's what makes it possible to keep moving forward. Grace, and then Peter.
So, I mean, in general, I really appreciate all of this, partly because as a longtime science fiction nerd from childhood, it really brings me into why that I've always believed that that's an important genre, and so thank you for all of that. And I just wanted to speak to the question of fear, because the tendency for most people, myself included, at times, is to run away and hide, to just try to shut it out. disconnect. Yeah, get back to the garden and not think about that stuff. But I think that there are ways of being able to confront the fear and go forward and recognize it and deal with it and accept the fact that there's fear and not let it make you want to run and hide. And I think, certain Buddhist practices that I'm familiar with have that goal, how to live with your fear, how to move forward despite all those negative, horrible emotions, and deal with reality. So I think that that's a piece that maybe needs to also be included in the way we present our potentialities, that we have the potentialities that exist, and hiding from the things that are really fearful is not going to get us there.
Peter and then Kathleen.
Thanks for both of your wonderful talks. I've been thinking about this quote from, I guess, Matisse about what takes courage to be creative, and I assume we all human beings are creative, but that one aspect of that courage is a hierarchy. It's like, I made something bad or good in that capitalist way of rating art. I meet children every day and ask them, are you creative? And they shrug and look at their parent or like this. I just wonder if you know of any sort of scene where it's safe and it's not hierarchical. What are your best examples of meeting this beautiful charge to, be an artist?
Is that a question?
Yeah.
Are we taking a few still? or-
Yeah, let's just hear from folks and then we can come back to us.
Okay.
Does that seem like a good idea?
Go with the flow.
Okay, good.
Okay, well, I'm fascinated with the solar park, and I want to learn more and read your paper again. I've been thinking a lot about the ways that, like, Bookchin and Adorno and all these people who wrote so wonderfully about aesthetics were really at the pinnacle of humanist philosophy. And I've become extremely interested in the post-humanist trend, the decentering of human exceptionalism. And I always wonder, how can we decenter human exceptionalism without falling prey to what Burry critiqued as the deep ecological hatred of humanity? And I'm fascinated with some of the new art forms I've been looking at, especially in music, that are totally collaborative with other species. It's like interactive symphonies with insects, things like that. And I think there's a way of focusing aesthetics on new kinds of interspecies relationships. And I wonder what you might, how that fits with the solar punk movement. It's not just a human-to-human social relations movement, but how can we make it a multi-species event and a new theory of aesthetics?
Oh, okay. I have one question and a little comment. But, so whenever I hear things about fear, I think of anxiety and I think of the mental health system and how that's being handled in this country in particular, and also how it is an intervention to prevent the transformation of that fear into something other that could be more. I feel like a lot of interventions are medication oriented, which isn't a replacement of fear, it's an annihilation of, taking away the fear. So I was kind of thinking of this utopian concept as a therapeutic method of transformation of these states, which, affect both our mental health and our philosophical outlooks. But then also Anya, your talk really made me want to share a utopian project that I'm very fond of, that still exists, If people aren't aware, there's this fellow named Fernand Zolligny, and he's French, and in the 1950s he established, because of he was an anti-fascist social psychologist and educator of children, and he specialized in nonverbal autism. And so he created commune with children, nonverbal communes. And his writings are just being translated in English, and a lot of his language is this melding of ideas of communication, networks. He uses the imagery of the spider in a lot of his language. But what I think is really cool is like, one of the things that they did with the folks that lived there was like draw maps of where they would go and create cartographic kind of expressions of inhabiting their space. So just to disrupt the verbal imperative that is so prominent in so many things that we talk about.
Great. Maybe we should do a round of responses and then come back.
Sure, I'll try to keep track of it all. The non-hierarchical scene, I think, is going to vary regionally, but I would look to like all ages venues as places to host things like that. Really thinking about infrastructure as like a foundation for creating a scene, and also lift up solar punk as like embracing amateurism and embracing. The idea, we made it one of the points of unity at Art Farm that everyone, artists for everyone, and everyone can be an artist. So creativity is our shared inheritance. Let's see, the piece about posthumanism. Yes, I agree. I mean, we specifically left it open that the artist is any active participant in this process, which I think opens the door to non-human or more than human participants. I think certainly, chimpanzee, cetacean, elephants, and probably other species as well, collaborations with insects that you mentioned. That's an area that we want to continue to explore deeper. We've curated group shows that involve artists collaborating with mushrooms. I regret that I had to cut all of the contemporary examples from my limited talk here. If you want to look, there's a longer version of this talk that we gave at the intensive that's on the ISC's YouTube, and we give examples of some contemporary work, including multi-species collaboration.
Let's give Anya a chance to respond to some of these thoughts.
Yeah, happily. I can only reinforce the notion that solarpunk particularly is a place that embraces amateurism. Quite a large amount of the solarpunk literature is just self-published and shared by people on the internet. The very first solarpunk novel that was published was shared for free on the internet in 2012. This does also translate to a lot of it that's not the finest literature, the most entertaining, but I think that's also brilliant. The multi-species point is interesting. We're going through a bit of, I'd say for about the last 15 years, we've been going through a multi-species turn. I think this is paradigmatically sort of exemplified in Donna Haraway's work about companion species, and also Anna Singh's Mushroom at the End of the World. Her point there is that we need to, it's a very post-modern point about erasing Cartesian binaries, dualisms, and seeing humans and nature as part of an assemblage, that our encounters with other species change both us and those species themselves, that nature is always agentive in these encounters, and that it's the idea of the intimate encounter that we need to focus in on. I mean, the reality of how does multi-species thinking, work and practice is challenging. I mean, it's always mediated by us, right? It's very hard to get the human out of the equation. But I think it's some of the most generative scholarship, I agree, is orienting around the multi-species question. Solarpunk also has a whole anthology called Multi-Species Cities that's all about the cities that we, from a more than human perspective. And thank you for the anecdote about the psychologist. I enjoyed that.
I'll just add that we need all these tools. You know, the psychological, the spiritual, the therapeutic, the artistic, the architectural, the agricultural, the organizational and movement building dimensions. And, you know, we each individually have our personal contributions to this spectrum that we're most impassioned by and most engaged in. And that's, to think holistically means we have a movement that's more than the sum of its parts. I think that's really the key to all of this. A lot of hands, and we have 2 minutes to lunchtime. We can get to lunch a little bit late. So let me just go this way. Start with Cora, and then Blair. Grace has one sentence, and then Micah, and Paul. I'm working my way around. Micah and Ed. Oh, that's this Paul.
Yes.
Paul, Micah, Ed, and Paul.
No.
Okay.
It's enough.
And Dan. So let's hear 30 seconds from each person, then maybe or maybe not we'll try to respond.
I'm wondering about whether utopianism, utopian vision is a collective vision or inherently really coming from an individual. It's not surprising that they wanted to communicate. Did they want to be understood, obeyed? You know, to communicate is the utopian. I grew up with someone who's, you know, really into Fourier's vision, and the dark side, which I believe, Max, you alluded to, of utopianism, we know this from the Goodmans, or the constructed environment, their vision, and then also with Charles Fourier, where you have enforcement mechanisms in case somebody was caught in a monogamous rather than a polyamorous relationship. But the point is that no artist wants a collective of people to like start making decisions about about what they're contributing. You know, maybe that's an exaggeration, but I think I'm asking about this dialectic between the individual and their artistic vision and our collective vision of how we should live together. The conflict, or maybe it's generative, but.
Just one metaphor that I like to use a lot, and we speak of in various circles, and that's that of mycelia. And building a social mycelia is kind of the tagline of the Vermont Healthy Soils Coalition and other groups. And it is, yeah, I'll just leave it at that. Mutual aid and communication, both.
Paul.
Thank you. I haven't been around IC in a long time, but I'm reminded of the strength of the theoretical language and the approach in a talk on aesthetics, which I also really value. I wonder if a presentation could be done completely without words, where you show us this healthy, natural, beautiful, verdant, life-giving experience and contrast it against the opposite of that. And driving up here this morning, I drove past that $6 Generals.
Ooh.
And I really like to get out of the theoretical and into practical. And this is actually something that the left and the right really agree upon is, why is everything so ugly now? Not everything, not this beautiful place, but the majority of America are these big box stores which are soul crushing and everything against to, you know, what I believe your presentation and direction is. So I think that actually offered this in a completely wordless, even silent presentation to actually prove to the viewer the truth and the accuracy of what we're purporting, which is the alternative to mainstream industrial society. Prove it, show it, demonstrate it, not just talk about it abstractly. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Blair.
Great talk, so much to think about. The theme I'm curious to hear your thoughts on is, what do you all make of the classical Marxian critique of utopianism, that it smuggles in too much of the assumptions and the limited imagination of the present? And we can break that down in a couple forms. I mean, for Max, I was specifically thinking of the Frankfurt School critical theories, Bilderverboten, the idea of like you cannot depict God, you cannot depict the good society because it will always fall short. Therefore, you can only have a negative utopia. You cannot show what the good society looks like. To do so would necessarily fail. And I was thinking here of those utopian images from the 1970s of Kate Farm, which now look quite quaint and old school to us. I mean, no offense taken, but like, how do you grapple with this aesthetically? So that's and for Anya, I was thinking about all the utopian hopes around the internet and communicative technologies from the 60s up until whatever, maybe the present. And does Bookchin perhaps fall prey to that as well with his faith in democratic deliberation as a transformative modality, and also maybe seeing Confederation as a network forum that could also just be, I mean, here's a core tension between, in utopian thought, between social reproduction and social transformation. And how do you all grapple with that politically, artistically, et cetera? And for us as social ecologists, I think about our own limitations, and that's been a critique of social ecologists, overly utopian, jumping the here and now, et cetera.
I think, Paul, you were next? You're going to pass. Oh, Micah, yes.
And Dan.
And Dan, thank
One
you.
thing just to comment on Paul's comment is there were a couple movies in the early 2000s. One of them was Korean Swati, which kind of did exactly that thing. But my question is, Max, like in terms of for aesthetic of social ecology, how much does that depend on the Eurocentric and modern conception of nature, which implies a difference from humans, and or critique of that concept, and also, yeah, because as we've seen increasingly in fascism and other right-wing ideologies, like the purification between the boundaries of human nature is very important to them in terms of valorizing nature as separate from humans, which, yeah, is being right-wing politics. And then one other just comment, I'm glad that Anya, you mentioned Donna Haraway, because I think that one of the kind of utopian visions I have read that's most interesting to me, because I think that it challenges the precepts of modernity the most, is actually Donna Haraway's vision at the end of her Staying with Trouble, which kind of really challenges the modern concept of individuality and also just species differences and anyway, yeah, the logics and modernity in general. I found that one to be very interesting.
Yeah, fantastic presentations. Thank you very much. Really great. And I think this is a crucial topic. I'd be really interested in hearing how these ideas can be translated and carry over and inform our moment that we find ourselves in right now, which I think we all agree is a moment of crisis and it requires action. My experience through a wide range of social movements going way back to the 60s has been that all too often we sort of create broad coalitions that are formed around the lowest common denominator, and that in that process a larger vision, a truly transformative and utopian vision, never has a chance to emerge. How can we ensure that these ideas and this vision, without being, without creating a blueprint, without reflecting the ideals of one person, which is one form of utopianism, but there's another form, which are utopian social movements, which are created with a sensibility that emerges collectively and gives us a sense, not just that yes, things are terrible and we need to change them, but a sense of directionality. How are we going to change them? What direction do we want to move? We need to have that vision. We need to have it clearly articulated. Otherwise, as we're protesting and doing the necessary work to try to stem off catastrophe, we'll end up chasing our tails. We have to have an orientation. And I'm wondering how that can be brought into current movements, like Paul mentioned Indivisible yesterday. well, they've been pretty successful in creating mass mobilizations, but how do we inform that with this broader vision of real change, not just let's vote in the Democrats? How do we bring these ideas to life?
So we're at 8 after 1. Let's take 1 minute each to wrap up, which is of course impossible. And of course these are inherently ongoing conversations.
You want me to start again?
Sure, that'd be great.
Okay, I'll try to take them on. Let's see, Cora, how democratic can a vision be? Dan, you just spoke to this. I agree. Any vision that makes claim to total validity risks lapsing into totalitarianism. But I also think we live in a fundamentally undemocratic society, so we're faced with this irony that we have to pursue democracy undemocratically. Let's see, Paul, I loved your observation about a wordless presentation. I regret having to cut a few slides that show more images. We have a whole section about how from 1800 to the present, a study that shows how consumer objects have become less colorful over time. There was a similar study earlier this year by the Washington Post, which looked at the facades of houses in Washington, D.C., and found that there's like a grayification of houses, and that corresponds with gentrification, increased home prices, kicking out black residents, things like that. So yes, I agree, like a more sensory experience is always something we're trying to figure out how to build. This was a lot of information to convey. Something I'm always working on. Blair, the Marxist critique of utopianism, I think we answer it first with a kind of idea of a process utopia. So it's not a fixed vision, it never stops, it forever recedes. It's always in development. And I agree with what Dan just said, that we need kind of a North Star, a vision guided by ethics. To the Eurocentric question, I just think we're drawing on social ecology's understanding of nature, which sees human society as dialectically unfolding out of biological evolution. So it's neither a monad nor a dyad. So I don't think we're falling into that trap. And then as far as how can these ideas be translated right now, I would refer you to our talk from the intensive that I mentioned, the videos online. One of the ideas that we present is art as autonomous infrastructure, in particular art as a cover for direct action, and we give a couple examples. And there's an entire presentation by the Breadbox Project, which is using art as a cover for reproductive freedom organizing in the South right now. It's a really inspiring project I would direct you to.
Anya?
I'll give it a shot. I was provoked. I was intrigued by the question of whether utopian visions are all individual and that utopian artists or people presenting these visions don't want collective engagement. I think that's not true for one interesting reason and one banal reason. I think the banal reason is that all utopian visions are necessarily a production based on all previous utopian visions. You look at The Dispossessed, and Le Guin only said that she could write that after reading all the classical anarchists. Had Michel, Bookchin, Kropotkin et al. Not written their own visions, I don't think we would have had The Dispossessed. So it is, per se, all sort of utopian visions are a collective product. The more interesting reason that I think utopian visions are collective, however, I was led to by an interview with a solar punk author called Serena Ulabari, where she mentioned that her writing her fiction was only half of the job. Her job was to imagine these futures and try to communicate them, but in reading, you have to do the work of co-creating them. You have to do the work of co-imagining them. Reading is itself an active, engaged process that's therefore collective in a more interesting way, I think. The Marx critique of utopianism, yeah, I think it's essentially true. But I come to a different conclusion. I agree. I don't think we can accurately represent utopia because utopia is always a product of our present time. That doesn't mean we shouldn't try. And that doesn't mean that it has no value. The value is nevertheless to energize, to further the collective vision, to have a kind of guidance. I think without any utopian visions, we would have capitalist realism, nihilism. Does Bookchin fall prey to the similar problems of cybernetics? It was an intriguing question. I think my entire presentation was more or less motivated by, whenever I read Bookchin, I'm keenly aware that he was on the cutting edge of the technology and the science of his time. He was ahead of his time, so to speak, and so I think every time I read an article that he's written, I think, what would Bookchin of 2025, if he lived now, be writing? And I think it would necessarily be something that was similarly cutting edge, on the cutting edge of technology, would be something that embraced the internet and digitality and cybernetics somehow. Whether that means that the answer is no longer municipal assemblies or in-person assemblies at all, I don't think so. I think even the people like Christian Fuchs, who are arguing for digital socialism, are still saying this is a supplement. This is essentially the role that I'm performing right now. I am hopefully communicating some interesting ideas that will be discussed in person, and that's always the productive locus for politics, for the social. As to how all this informs what we do now, well, that's kind of the big question. I'm partial to the idea that dual power is essentially the answer, but these sorts of visions are helping us shape institutions that will carry us through the transition and live on afterwards, that we have to do the work at some point, so we ought to do it now. But I know that's not a very satisfactory answer. Over to you, Brian.
In the interest of time and lunch, I'll just mention one source that I've gotten a lot of inspiration from over the last couple of years that addresses some aspects of what Blair and Dan raised, and that's a international compendium that I actually had the privilege to contribute a short 2 or 3 page piece on social ecology to, that's called Pluriverse. And it's edited by scholars on 4 or 5 different continents, some of whom are known to folks here, like Arturo Escobar and Ariel Saleh from Australia, and Ashish Kothari from India, whose work is really stellar in some of these same directions, and also somebody from South America. And this is a compendium of short chapters describing forward-looking, communally oriented worldviews from cultures from literally every corner of the world, from urban movements, from remote indigenous cultures, and everything in between. And the complementarity of the shared visions put forward by this set of about 125 writers from all around the world, to me speaks to the potential for a movement that really is more than some of its parts, and that avoids some of the pitfalls of the past and brings together a genuinely internationalist, genuinely decolonial outlook on ways we can continue to move forward.
Can you give us the title?
Pluriverse.
How would you spell it?
Pluriverse.
Universal Dictionary.
Yeah, if you go to the website called I'll remember the name later. You can download the whole book for free. Global something of alternatives. Global Tapestry of Alternatives, I think, is the website.
They're part of the global transition.
Yeah. You can download the whole book for free.
You can have a follow-up, and Eleanor has written a piece on social ecology.
All right. What's it called?
Social ecology. So it's a dictionary. The design, or you mean the Global Tapestry of Alternatives?
Yeah. No, what's the new book?
Well, technically, it's called a dictionary, but that may change.
Yeah, because this was originally going to be the post-development dictionary, vibing off of, what's his name's development dictionary in the Wolfgang Sachs in the 90s. but then they decided that pluriverse was a title that spoke to the whole of it a lot better. So lunch should be ready. We'll be back at whatever time and hear from Grace and Gabe and Sean and also our friend Michelle Edelman McCormick from Cooperation Vermont.